In 1847, while renovating an abandoned church in Millfield, Ohio, workers uncovered a hidden compartment beneath the ornately carved pulpit. Sealed with an elaborate mechanism that had evaded detection for decades, the compartment held a weathered leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age yet meticulously preserved. Inside were records of deaths, over 8,000 names, each entry written in the same precise handwriting, documenting date, location, cause, and, most disturbingly, property values and asset calculations. Alongside this grim ledger were 15 carefully drawn maps of settlements across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, each marked with the same chilling phrase, *the Promised Land**. The maps featured detailed topographical markings indicating swamplands, floodplains, and other dangerous terrain, with annotations about seasonal disease patterns and projected mortality rates. Before we continue with the story of the Westbrook family's reign of terror across the Ohio frontier, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you enjoy uncovering the darkest secrets of American history. This channel is exclusively for those brave enough to face the disturbing truths that mainstream historians often ignore. Let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. Perhaps you're closer to one of the Westbrooks' promised lands than you realize. Now, let's return to the beginning of this horrifying tale. The early 1800s marked a period of intense religious fervor across America. The Second Great Awakening swept through the newly formed United States, bringing with it revival meetings, spiritual renewal, and a wave of new religious movements. This religious revolution transformed American society, particularly on the frontier where the absence of established churches created fertile ground for charismatic preachers and innovative theologies. Joseph Harkins, the master carpenter overseeing the renovation, later testified that his hands trembled so violently upon reading the first pages that he could barely close the journal. It wasn't just a record of deaths, he told the Cincinnati Enquirer in an interview conducted months later. It was a business ledger. Human lives calculated as profit and loss. Church officials immediately contacted local authorities, and Sheriff William Blackwood arrived to take possession of the materials. By morning, however, both the journal and maps had mysteriously disappeared from the locked cabinet in the sheriff's office. 3 days later, Sheriff Blackwood was found dead in his home, officially recorded as heart failure, though rumors persisted that his skin bore unusual discoloration and his eyes remained fixed in an expression of absolute terror. The deputy who discovered the body, Thomas Reed, resigned his position the following week and left Ohio entirely, refusing for the remainder of his life to discuss what he had seen in the sheriff's bedroom. For nearly 2 centuries, the Westbrook family's Millfield mystery has remained one of America's most disturbing religious conspiracies, a calculated scheme that claimed thousands of lives through what might be the most sinister land speculation plot in American history. The documents discovered that day in 1847 provided the first comprehensive evidence of a conspiracy that had been whispered about for decades, but never fully proven until that moment. Before we continue with the story of the Westbrook family's reign of terror across the Ohio frontier, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you enjoy uncovering the darkest secrets of American history. This channel is exclusively for those brave enough to face the disturbing truths that mainstream historians often ignore. Let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. Perhaps you're closer to one of the Westbrooks' promised lands than you realize. Now, let's return to the beginning of this horrifying tale. The early 1800s marked a period of intense religious fervor across America. The Second Great Awakening swept through the newly formed United States, bringing with it revival meetings, spiritual renewal, and a wave of new religious movements. This religious revolution transformed American society, particularly on the frontier, where the absence of established churches created fertile ground for charismatic preachers and innovative theologies. Camp meetings could draw thousands of people who would travel for days to attend, often experiencing what they described as direct divine intervention, fainting, speaking in tongues, and receiving visions that changed the course of their lives. Ohio, having achieved statehood in 1803, represented the gateway to America's western frontier, a place where land was plentiful, oversight was minimal, and ambitious men could reinvent themselves far from the watchful eyes of established society. The state experienced explosive growth during this period, its population increasing from just 45,000 in 1800 to over 580,000 by 1820. This rapid expansion created a chaotic environment where new settlements appeared seemingly overnight and religious communities could establish themselves with minimal scrutiny. Among the men drawn to this opportunity was Isaiah Westbrook, a failed merchant from Hartford, Connecticut, who arrived in Chillicothe, Ohio, in the spring of 1803. Unlike many settlers who came with dreams of farming or trading, Isaiah arrived with something far more valuable, a vision, or so he claimed. Standing over 6 feet tall with piercing blue eyes and a commanding presence enhanced by a full beard kept meticulously groomed, Isaiah quickly established himself as a lay preacher, initially working within established Methodist circuits but gradually forming his own independent congregation. He possessed a voice that contemporaries described as thunder wrapped in velvet, powerful enough to reach the back of any gathering, yet intimate enough to make each listener feel personally addressed. "God has led me to this place," he told the small group who gathered to hear him speak in the town square that first summer, his voice carrying across the humid Ohio air. "He has shown me that this land, this Ohio country, is to be a new Jerusalem for his chosen people. The old churches of the East have grown corrupt and complacent. Here, where the forests still echo with the voice of creation, we shall build a pure faith." Isaiah's charisma was undeniable. Those who encountered him frequently described an unusual intensity in his gaze, a certainty in his words that seemed to transcend ordinary faith. Hannah Weathers, whose journal provides one of the few first-hand accounts of Isaiah's early preaching, wrote, "When Reverend Westbrook speaks of divine visions, even the most skeptical find themselves nodding in agreement. There is something in his eyes that makes disbelief seem impossible, as though he can see straight through to your soul and address the doubts you've never spoken aloud." Within months, his roadside sermons were drawing crowds from miles around. By winter, a small but devoted congregation had formed around him, calling themselves the faithful of the new promise. Isaiah's theology was a calculated blend of familiar Christian doctrine and innovative interpretations that positioned him as a uniquely authoritative voice. He emphasized direct divine revelation, the imminent establishment of sacred communities, and the special status of those who recognized his calling, elements that would later prove crucial to his scheme. What few of Isaiah's followers knew was that he was not alone in his enterprise. His younger brothers, Daniel and Samuel Westbrook, had arrived quietly in Ohio several months before him, traveling separately and establishing themselves in different settlements to avoid arousing suspicion. While Isaiah preached, Daniel and Samuel were busy purchasing large tracts of land throughout the region, often selecting properties that appeared worthless on paper, swamplands, rocky hillsides, and flood-prone river bottoms. They paid pennies on the dollar for these seemingly worthless parcels, using funds from their family's failed mercantile business in Connecticut, money that rightfully belonged to their creditors. Each brother played a distinct and carefully calculated role in their emerging enterprise. Isaiah, the eldest at 36 when they arrived in Ohio, provided the charismatic leadership and theological framework. With his commanding presence and persuasive oratory, he became the public face of their movement. Daniel, the middle brother at 33, possessed a scholarly demeanor and had studied briefly at Yale Divinity School before financial troubles forced his withdrawal. He crafted the theological justifications for their scheme, producing volumes of religious texts that lent intellectual credibility to Isaiah's visions. Samuel, the youngest at 29, was the practical executive, a shrewd businessman with a talent for property law and financial manipulation who managed their growing portfolio of land holdings. Court records from Connecticut reveal that the Westbrook brothers had attempted a smaller version of their scheme in Rhode Island 2 years earlier, establishing a short-lived religious community that collapsed amid accusations of financial impropriety. They departed just ahead of legal proceedings, leaving behind substantial debts and several investors who claimed to have been defrauded. This earlier failure appeared to have taught them valuable lessons about the scale and isolation necessary for their deception to succeed. The Westbrook brothers established their first permanent church in Millfield in 1805, a modest wooden structure that nonetheless featured an unusually elevated pulpit with ornate carvings. Crafted personally by Samuel, who had trained as a carpenter, the pulpit's height was deliberate, placing Isaiah physically above his congregation in a visual reinforcement of his spiritual authority. The church's founding coincided with Isaiah's most significant revelation to date. "God has shown me a vision," he announced to his congregation on a cold January morning, his breath visible in the unheated church. There is a place not 30 miles from here that he has designated as a promised land for our people. A place of abundance where those faithful to our calling shall prosper as never before. The Lord has guided my hand in securing this sacred ground for our community, that we might establish a settlement pure in His sight. This first promised land was located near present-day Logan, Ohio, a marshy area in the Hocking River Valley that the Westbrooks had purchased for a fraction of its assessed value due to its reputation for summer fevers. What Isaiah's followers didn't know was that this land sat in one of the worst malaria zones in the entire Ohio Valley, a fact well documented by earlier settlers who had abandoned attempts to farm there after experiencing devastating losses. James Harrington, a farmer who had briefly settled in the area 2 years earlier and lost 3 children to disease, attempted to warn several families about the danger. "That place is death in summer," he reportedly told Ezekiel Winters, one of Isaiah's most devoted followers, catching him after a service one Sunday. "When the heat comes, the fever follows. I lost 2 children there before I understood what was happening. No amount of clearing or drainage will fix that land. Something in the very air brings sickness." His warnings went unheeded. Isaiah had prepared for such skepticism, incorporating it into his theology. "There will be those who test your faith," he told his followers during a sermon that specifically addressed Harrington's warnings without naming him directly. "Those who fear the promised land because they lack the spiritual protection that comes only through absolute devotion. Satan will send his messengers to plant seeds of doubt in your hearts. This is how your commitment will be tested." By March 1805, 47 families comprising 192 people had sold their homes and businesses, pooling their resources to purchase parcels in the Westbrooks' first promised land. The price, while seemingly reasonable on paper, represented a markup of over 500% from what the brothers had paid just months earlier. Isaiah led them personally to the settlement, helping establish a temporary church and organizing the construction of simple cabins. He remained with them through April, conducting daily services and overseeing the development of the community. The settlement took shape around a central meeting house, with family cabins arranged in concentric circles that Isaiah described as reflecting the divine order of heaven. Each morning began with communal prayer, and 3 times weekly the entire settlement gathered for extended services where Isaiah expounded on his growing theology of divine selection and spiritual purification through hardship. Eden was not built without labor, he frequently reminded them as they struggled to clear the waterlogged land for planting. The promised land of our ancestors required 40 years of wandering to reach. Our testing may come in different forms, but our reward will be no less glorious. Then, as May approached and the first mosquitoes appeared in troubling numbers, Isaiah announced another revelation. "God calls me to prepare the way for more of His chosen," he declared during an evening service, his voice solemn. "I must return to Millfield to guide others to their salvation, that they too might join our holy enterprise." He departed the following morning, taking with him Daniel, who had served as the settlement's record keeper, leaving Samuel to oversee the community's continued development. What happened next was documented by Elizabeth Winters, wife of Ezekiel, whose diary remained hidden in the wall of their cabin until its discovery in 1890. The journal, now preserved at the Ohio Historical Society, provides the most comprehensive first-hand account of life in the first Westbrook settlement. By June, the first cases of malaria appeared, primarily among children and the elderly. By mid-July, the settlement had established its first cemetery. By August, that cemetery contained 73 graves. "Buried little Sarah today," Elizabeth wrote on August 12, 1805, her handwriting increasingly unsteady as the entry progressed. "That makes 17 graves in the burial ground since last week. The fever takes them so quickly now. Healthy at breakfast, delirious by supper, gone before the next dawn. Ezekiel insists this is a test of faith, but I cannot understand what God would want with so many innocent souls. I suggested returning to Millfield, but Ezekiel says Reverend Westbrook warned that those who abandon the promised land abandon their salvation." Samuel Westbrook visits each new grave, writing in his book with such careful attention, you would think he was recording births rather than deaths. The diary entry from September 3 reveals a troubling detail. Samuel spends hours in his cabin with his ledgers. "Through the window yesterday, I saw him making calculations after the Miller family was found dead in their home. for more souls for his books. There is something unnatural in his precision. No grief, only numbers. By October, more than half the settlement's population had perished. The survivors, weakened and impoverished, abandoned their claims and scattered. Many died on the journey to other settlements, their bodies discovered by travelers along the crude roads leading away from the promised land. Those who made it to established towns found themselves objects of both pity and suspicion, victims of what many locals considered a bizarre religious cult. Meanwhile, in Millfield, Isaiah expressed profound sorrow at the tragedy, incorporating it into a series of powerful sermons on faith tested by adversity. Our brothers and sisters have been called to heaven before us, he preached to his growing congregation, his voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. Their sacrifice has hallowed the ground and prepared the way for a new revelation. The Lord tests most severely those he loves most dearly. What none of his followers realized was that Isaiah had already directed Samuel to quietly reclaim ownership of the abandoned properties through a network of legal proxies. By December 1805, the Westbrooks had recovered virtually all the land from their failed settlement, now at no cost to themselves, while retaining the original purchase funds paid by the settlers. This land would later be resold to timber speculators once the region's malaria reputation had faded from public memory. This pattern would repeat itself over the next 3 decades with frightening precision. Between 1805 and 1840, the Westbrook brothers established 15 different promised land settlements across Ohio, Indiana, and eventually Illinois. Each followed the same essential formula: Isaiah would announce a divine revelation identifying a new sacred site, Daniel would produce theological justifications and organize the faithful, Samuel would handle the practical matters of land transactions and construction. The brothers refined their method with each iteration. Later promised lands included not just malarial swamps, but also arid areas prone to crop failure, flood zones that would drown spring plantings, and heavily forested regions that required impossible amounts of labor to clear for farming. In each case, the land appeared promising to inexperienced eyes but harbored fatal flaws obvious to experienced settlers. Their fourth settlement, established near present-day Marion, Ohio in 1810, introduced a new element to their scheme. This location sat on a floodplain that appeared fertile and well-watered during the dry autumn when prospective settlers were first shown the property. What Isaiah described as God's blessing of abundant water was in reality a seasonal flooding pattern that would inundate the entire settlement each spring, destroying crops, contaminating wells, and spreading waterborne diseases. Particularly ingenious was their seventh settlement in western Ohio, established in 1815. This location featured what appeared to be exceptionally fertile soil, dark and rich-looking. In reality, the soil contained a high clay content that retained water poorly and formed a cement-like crust when dry, making agriculture nearly impossible. By the time settlers discovered this reality, winter had set in, leaving them trapped in an unsustainable location until spring, by which time starvation and disease had claimed dozens of lives. What the Westbrooks perfected was a form of religious exploitation unprecedented in American history, wrote historian Margaret Sinclair in her 1998 analysis of the case. They deliberately selected lands that would produce maximum casualties within the first year of settlement, allowing them to reclaim and resell the properties multiple times to new groups of faithful. Their scheme combined the worst elements of religious manipulation and predatory capitalism, weaponizing faith against the very people who embraced it most fervently. The second critical component of the Westbrook scheme emerged around 1810, when they began requiring all members of their movement to sign a covenant of faith, a document that appeared to be a spiritual commitment but functioned as a legal transfer of property rights. These covenants, drafted by Daniel with input from legal advisors the brothers quietly consulted in Cincinnati, stipulated that if a settler abandoned their land or died without direct heirs who were members of the faith, their property would revert to the church, which, legally speaking, meant the Westbrook brothers. The covenant's language was masterfully crafted to conceal its true purpose beneath layers of religious terminology. As Moses led his people through the wilderness toward lands flowing with milk and honey, so too do I commit my worldly possessions to the greater glory of our shared journey. Should the Lord call me to his side before my earthly work is complete, or should my faith falter and I depart from our sacred community, I hereby consecrate my portion of the promised land to the continuing ministry of our church, that others might benefit from the blessings I have received. Court records from Franklin County, Ohio, show that between 1812 and 1815 alone, the Westbrooks reclaimed ownership of over 400 parcels of land through these covenant clauses, most following the deaths of entire families in their third Promised Land settlement. The value of these reclaimed properties, even at frontier prices, exceeded $50,000, an enormous sum for the period, equivalent to millions in today's currency. As you hear these disturbing details about how the Westbrooks manipulated religious devotion for profit, consider the psychology behind such calculated deception. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our research into America's hidden horrors, and don't forget to subscribe. This channel uncovers the stories mainstream historians often ignore, and the Westbrook conspiracy goes much deeper than most people realize. Let's continue our investigation into how these three brothers maintained their deadly scheme for decades. By 1820, the Westbrooks had amassed considerable wealth. Isaiah, now styling himself Prophet Westbrook, had established a central church in Columbus, Ohio, that rivaled the grandeur of many East Coast cathedrals. The building, constructed of locally quarried limestone with impressive stained glass windows imported from Philadelphia, stood as a physical testament to the movement's success. Its most striking feature was a towering steeple visible from miles away, a beacon drawing new converts to the Westbrooks' growing enterprise. Daniel had taken the title to apostle of the scripture and maintained a complex theological framework that justified their increasingly elaborate demands of followers. His prolific writings filled multiple volumes, creating a distinctive theology that combined elements of Methodism, Presbyterianism, and innovative doctrines uniquely suited to the brothers' purposes. His central theological innovation, the concept of progressive revelation, held that God continuously revealed new truths to selected prophets, primarily Isaiah, and that questioning these revelations constituted a form of spiritual rebellion equivalent to heresy. Samuel, the most private of the brothers, managed their extensive property holdings and financial affairs from a fortified estate outside Cincinnati. Unlike his more public brothers, Samuel cultivated a reclusive image, reinforcing the perception that he was engaged in deeply spiritual work requiring isolation. In reality, his estate functioned as the operational headquarters for their financial empire, with a small staff of clerks maintaining detailed records of properties, deaths, and profits. Their organization had evolved significantly from its humble beginnings. By 1825, the Westbrook Church claimed over 3,000 members across Ohio and neighboring states. Most of these adherents were not residents of the deadly Promised Land settlements, but rather conventional congregants who attended regular services and provided financial support through tithes and donations. This broader membership provided both legitimacy and a continuous stream of potential recruits for new settlements. The brothers had also developed a hierarchical structure that insulated them from direct involvement in the most controversial aspects of their operation. Elders and deacons, trusted lieutenants who had proven their loyalty, now handled many of the day-to-day responsibilities of settlement management and property transfers. This arrangement allowed the Westbrooks to maintain plausible deniability about conditions in the settlements while continuing to profit from their collapse. Their growing wealth enabled increasingly sophisticated methods of operation. Land purchases were now conducted through a network of shell companies and proxies, making it difficult to trace property ownership back to the church. Settlement supplies were provided through church-owned businesses at inflated prices, creating an additional revenue stream. Even burial services for the inevitable casualties were monetised through a church-controlled mortuary operation that charged grieving families for consecrated caskets and cemetery plots. The brothers might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the arrival of a young woman named Martha Collins. In the spring of 1838, Martha, a 22-year-old from a respected Boston family, traveled to Columbus to visit her cousin Emma, who had joined the Westbrooks Church the previous year. The daughter of a prominent attorney with connections to Massachusetts political circles, Martha had received an education unusual for women of her era, including studies in accounting and property law under her father's guidance. Described in contemporary accounts as possessing a quiet determination and uncommon perceptiveness, Martha initially attended services out of politeness to her cousin but quickly became concerned by what she witnessed. She noted discrepancies between the church's proclaimed values and its operational practices, particularly the lavish lifestyle enjoyed by the Westbrook brothers in contrast to the austere conditions encouraged among their followers. Isaiah Westbrook is no ordinary preacher, she wrote to her father in April 1838 in a letter preserved in the Collins family archives. He speaks with an authority that seems to bypass people's reason entirely. When he identifies families chosen for the next promised land settlement, they respond as if receiving the greatest of honors. Though I've noticed these selections often target those who have recently come into inheritance or sold businesses for cash. There is a calculated pattern to these selections that troubles me deeply. Martha's letter continued with an observation that demonstrated her unusual perceptiveness. The most disturbing aspect is not the content of his sermons, but rather what happens in their aftermath. I have observed Samuel Westbrook, the brother who rarely preaches, engaged in quiet conversations with church elders immediately following the announcement of chosen families. These discussions have the character of business transactions rather than spiritual counseling. Martha's suspicions deepened when her cousin Emma was selected for the sacred honor of serving as a personal assistant to Daniel Westbrook. This position gave Emma, and by extension, Martha, access to the private offices maintained by the brothers in Columbus. Martha leveraged this opportunity with remarkable strategic thinking, crafting a persona of naive devotion that allowed her to move through the church's headquarters without arousing suspicion. What Martha discovered there would ultimately unravel the Westbrooks' empire. While organizing papers in Daniel's study one afternoon in early May, she came across a locked cabinet of unusual design. Emma, having been entrusted with keys as part of her duties, innocently provided access when Martha expressed curiosity about its contents. Inside, Martha found detailed maps of all 15 promised land settlements, with annotations documenting soil conditions, drainage problems, and disease patterns. Most disturbing were the meticulous records of deaths, thousands of names organized by settlement and year, with property values noted alongside each family. These documents revealed the full extent of the Westbrook scheme, including projections of expected mortality rates for each settlement location and calculations of anticipated property reclamation values. One particularly disturbing document outlined what was called the selection criteria for covenant families, a methodology for identifying prospective settlers with maximum financial assets and minimal extended family connections who might later make claims on their property. I cannot express the horror I felt, Martha later wrote in a deposition given to Ohio state authorities. These were not records of tragic losses. They were inventory lists, human lives reduced to financial calculations with projected mortality rates for each settlement. They knew. They had always known exactly what would happen to these people. The deaths that Isaiah proclaimed as divine tests were in fact carefully engineered outcomes designed to maximize property acquisition while minimizing legal complications. Martha's discovery coincided with the Westbrooks' preparations for their 16th settlement, potentially their most ambitious and deadly. Located in a remote area of southern Illinois, this new promised land sat in a region notorious for both malaria and violent conflicts with remaining Native American populations. Internal documents suggested the brothers anticipated a mortality rate exceeding 70% within 6 months. The Illinois settlement represented an evolution of their scheme. Documents in Daniel's cabinet revealed plans to extend their operations beyond the confines of their own church, with strategies for recruiting settlers from German and Scandinavian immigrant communities who would be less familiar with frontier conditions and American legal protections. The projected revenue from this single settlement exceeded $75,000, more than all their previous operations combined. Over the course of several weeks, Martha secretly copied key documents, including settlement maps and portions of the death records. Working late at night in her boarding house room, she meticulously reproduced the evidence, concealing these copies inside a hollowed-out Bible, an ironic hiding place for evidence of religious exploitation. Her plan was to escape back to Boston with this evidence and alert federal authorities through her father's political connections. However, as the day of her departure approached, she noticed a change in how she was treated within the church community. Church members who had previously been friendly became distant or overly interested in her activities. She observed unfamiliar men watching the boarding house where she stayed. Emma tells me that Daniel has been asking unusual questions about my activities, she wrote in her final letter home, which was never sent but later discovered hidden in her Columbus boarding house. Yesterday, Isaiah invited me to a private prayer meeting to discuss what he called concerns about my spiritual commitment. I declined, claiming illness. This morning, I noticed a man following me through the market. I fear they suspect something. If anything should happen to me, please know that the Westbrook brothers are not men of God, but merchants of death. Their promised lands are killing fields deliberately chosen for their deadly conditions. Martha's fears were justified. Unknown to her, a church member had observed her copying documents late one evening and reported this to Samuel Westbrook. The Westbrooks immediately launched a discreet investigation into their potential security breach, with Samuel personally traveling to Columbus from Cincinnati to manage the situation. Church records obtained decades later reveal an emergency meeting of the brothers and their inner circle on May 15, 1838, with a cryptic agenda item addressing the Collins situation. On the evening of May 17, 1838, Martha attempted to board a stagecoach bound for Pittsburgh, the first leg of her journey home. She never made it. According to the stagecoach operator's log, a young woman matching Martha's description approached the station but was intercepted by two men who escorted her away after a brief conversation. A witness later described seeing her enter a church carriage accompanied by a man believed to be Samuel Westbrook. She was never seen again. The official explanation provided by the Westbrook Church was that Martha had received a divine calling to join the advanced preparation team for the Illinois settlement. When her family in Boston made inquiries, they received letters supposedly written by Martha describing her spiritual journey and requesting no further contact with her former life. Handwriting experts would later confirm these letters were forgeries, likely written by Daniel Westbrook, whose scholarly background included training in document preparation. Martha's disappearance might have remained just another mystery had it not triggered a chain of events that would ultimately expose the Westbrooks' crimes. Her father, William Collins, a prominent Boston attorney with connections to Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster, refused to accept the church's explanation. He traveled to Columbus in July 1838 and launched his own investigation, hiring local detectives and offering substantial rewards for information. Collins was not a man to be underestimated. His legal practice had handled several high-profile cases in Massachusetts, and he approached his daughter's disappearance with the same methodical determination that had made him successful in the courtroom. He established a base of operations in Columbus and began systematically interviewing church members, offering financial incentives for information that quickly exceeded what the Westbrooks could counter. This external pressure coincided with growing internal fractures within the Westbrook organization. Their decades of success had bred arrogance and carelessness. Isaiah's sermons had become increasingly apocalyptic, promising divine retribution against enemies of the faith, thinly veiled threats against anyone who questioned their authority. Daniel had developed a laudanum dependency that affected his reliability, occasionally making contradictory theological pronouncements that confused followers. Samuel, always the most pragmatic brother, had begun transferring assets to accounts in New Orleans, possibly planning an exit strategy. These vulnerabilities created an opening for Jacob Miller, a deacon in the Columbus Church who had served the Westbrooks faithfully for nearly 20 years. Miller had recently lost his daughter and grandchildren in the Illinois settlement's first summer, victims of what church records dispassionately classified as marsh fever. His grief turned to rage when he accidentally discovered documents suggesting the Westbrooks had specific knowledge of the settlement's deadly conditions before sending settlers there. The tipping point came when Miller overheard Samuel discussing Martha Collins's permanent silence with another church elder. The conversation, which took place in what they thought was an empty church office, included references to handling the situation the same way we handled the Peterson woman in 29, an apparent reference to another disappearance that had never been investigated. In September 1838, Miller made contact with William Collins, providing insider confirmation of Martha's discoveries. More importantly, he revealed the existence of the brothers' most closely guarded secret, a master ledger containing records of all deaths, property transfers, and profits from each settlement since 1805. This ledger, which the brothers referred to as the accounting, was supposedly kept in a hidden compartment beneath the pulpit of the original Millfield Church, which now served primarily as a historical shrine for the movement. They call it the accounting, Miller told Collins in a sworn statement, but not in the sense of financial records alone. It's their understanding of a divine accounting, a record they believe justifies their actions. Isaiah has convinced himself that these deaths serve a greater purpose. Daniel has constructed elaborate theological justifications. But Samuel, he sees only the prophets. He keeps that ledger as a businessman keeps a record of successful transactions. Armed with this information, Collins approached Ohio Governor Wilson Shannon, who authorized a discreet investigation to avoid tipping off the Westbrooks. State authorities planned a coordinated seizure of documents from multiple church locations for December 1838, but their operation was compromised by a church sympathizer working in the governor's office. Warned of the impending investigation, the Westbrooks initiated what church members were told was a purification ritual, in reality, a massive destruction of incriminating evidence. Fires burned for 3 days at church properties throughout Ohio, with Samuel personally overseeing the removal of financial records from their Cincinnati headquarters. Witnesses reported seeing wagons loaded with document boxes departing for unknown destinations under armed guard. The most dramatic confrontation occurred at the Millfield Church, where Isaiah himself arrived with several loyal followers to retrieve the accounting. They were interrupted by local Sheriff Thomas Redfield, who had received an anonymous tip, later revealed to be from Jacob Miller. The ensuing confrontation left 2 church members dead and Isaiah wounded, but the Westbrooks escaped with most of their critical documentation. This episode launched what newspapers of the day called the Westbrook Exodus. Over the next 3 months, the brothers liquidated what assets they could and fled south toward New Orleans with approximately 60 loyal followers. Their journey was tracked through Kentucky and Tennessee by a combination of private detectives hired by Collins and federal marshals responding to formal charges of fraud and conspiracy filed in Ohio courts. The investigation expanded as they fled, with authorities in multiple states discovering additional evidence of the brothers' crimes. In a Nashville hotel room abandoned by Daniel, investigators found partial records suggesting the brothers had begun exploring similar schemes in Texas and even Central America, with notes about settlement opportunities in regions known for yellow fever and other tropical diseases. The brothers' final days remain shrouded in conflicting accounts. The most widely accepted version, based on court testimonies from former followers who later surrendered to authorities, places all 3 Westbrooks on a steamboat bound for New Orleans in February 1839. According to these accounts, as federal authorities closed in, Samuel betrayed his brothers, escaping with most of their remaining fortune during a stop in Natchez, Mississippi. Sarah Holloway, one of the loyal followers who accompanied the brothers on their flight south, later provided testimony that offered rare insight into the brothers' deteriorating relationship. By Natchez, they were hardly speaking. Isaiah spent his days in prayer, convinced that divine intervention would yet save them. Daniel was barely coherent most days, lost in laudanum dreams. Samuel watched them both with growing contempt. The night before we reached Natchez, I overheard him tell Isaiah, "Your God has abandoned us, brother. It's time I look to my own salvation." Isaiah and Daniel, now fugitives with dwindling resources, reportedly continued to New Orleans, where they attempted to secure passage to Cuba. On the night of March 12, 1839, both brothers were killed in what local police recorded as a merchant dispute turned violent at the New Orleans waterfront. Some historians suggest this convenient end to the manhunt might actually represent an extrajudicial killing sanctioned by authorities who feared the brothers' trial would create embarrassing revelations about how they had operated with impunity for so long. A dock worker who witnessed the incident later claimed that Isaiah died clutching a small leather-bound book to his chest, potentially a portion of the accounting that had not been recovered. His final words reportedly were not prayers, but a defiant claim, "Our work is recorded in heaven. You cannot erase what we have built." Samuel Westbrook's fate remains the most mysterious. Various reports placed him in Cuba, Mexico, and even England in the years following his brothers' deaths. The most credible account comes from Brazilian police records, which document the 1847 arrest of an American calling himself Samuel West for operating a fraudulent religious colony near São Paulo. The description matches Samuel Westbrook, and the scheme bore remarkable similarities to the Ohio operations. This suspect died in custody before trial, reportedly from self-administered poison. A journal confiscated from Samuel West by Brazilian authorities contained passages that seemed to confirm his identity. "My brothers lacked vision. They saw our work as confined to the American frontier. I always understood that our model could function anywhere faith blinds people to reason. The principles remain sound, though implementation must adapt to local conditions. What's most disturbing about the Westbrooks isn't just the scale of their crimes, estimated to have caused between 7,000 and 9,000 deaths over 3 decades, but how effectively they exploited America's religious landscape to commit them. They operated during a period of intense spiritual experimentation, when new denominations and religious movements emerged regularly across the frontier. Their settlements were isolated enough to avoid scrutiny but close enough to transportation networks to attract new victims. They exploited fundamental weaknesses in America's developing society: the lack of communication between scattered communities, the absence of regulatory oversight on the frontier, and, most critically, the constitutional protections for religious practice that made authorities reluctant to investigate even suspicious church activities. Their operation represented a perfect storm of religious manipulation, geographical isolation, and financial exploitation that allowed mass casualties to accumulate for decades without intervention, wrote historian James Thornton in his landmark analysis, *Faith and Fraud on the Frontier*. The Westbrooks understood something fundamental about America during this period: religious freedom, one of our nation's greatest virtues, created space for both genuine spiritual innovation and deadly exploitation. The frontier's distance from established authority structures made it impossible to distinguish dangerous cults from sincere new denominations until it was often too late. In this regulatory vacuum, the brothers constructed what may be the most profitable murder scheme in American history. The brothers' operation worked not just because of their cunning, but because it exploited deep psychological vulnerabilities. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, a historian specializing in 19th-century religious movements, explains, the Westbrooks offered what every frontier settler desperately needed: community, purpose, and divine reassurance in a chaotic and dangerous environment. By framing their settlements as divinely chosen locations, they transformed ordinary land speculation into a sacred calling. Questioning the promised land wasn't just expressing doubt about real estate, it was challenging God's will itself. What made their manipulation particularly effective was how they integrated it with legitimate religious practices. Sunday services in Westbrook churches followed recognizable Protestant formats. Their hymns were standard Methodist and Baptist compositions. Their basic theological tenets, salvation through faith, the importance of community, preparation for Christ's return, aligned with mainstream Christianity. This veneer of normalcy made the dangerous innovations harder to detect. Few people realized that what made the Westbrook scheme so effective was their deep understanding of both theology and human psychology. In a time when religious identity was central to most Americans' lives, they crafted a narrative that made questioning their authority equivalent to questioning God himself. This channel is exclusively for those who seek the unvarnished truth about America's darkest chapters. If you've stayed with us this far, you're clearly someone who values historical honesty over comfortable myths. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell if you haven't already, and share this video with others who appreciate these hidden histories. The aftermath of the Westbrook conspiracy reverberated through American society for decades. In Ohio, the scandal prompted the first state laws regulating religious land holdings and requiring financial transparency from churches. The Westbrook regulations, as they came to be known, established precedents for distinguishing between religious freedom and fraudulent exploitation that influenced legislation in multiple states. Several promised land settlements were eventually reclaimed by survivors and their descendants, though many remained abandoned, grim monuments to a tragedy too painful to reclaim. The sites themselves became the subject of local legends and superstitions. The original Logan settlement, where the first victims died, remained uninhabited for nearly 50 years after the Westbrooks' exposure. Local residents reported unusual phenomena around the abandoned cabins, though these stories likely reflected the psychological impact of knowing what had occurred there rather than any supernatural presence. When the land was finally redeveloped in the 1890s, workers reportedly refused to dig foundations near the old settlement cemetery. The most complete accounting of the Westbrooks' victims came through the persistent efforts of William Collins, who continued investigating long after the brothers' deaths. Working with Jacob Miller and other former church members, Collins established the Westbrook Victims Registry, which documented 8,432 deaths directly attributable to the brothers' settlements. This registry, maintained at the Ohio Historical Society until 1915, provided the basis for limited restitution payments to survivors authorized by the Ohio legislature in 1845. Collins dedicated the remainder of his life to this cause, spending his considerable fortune tracking down survivors and documenting the brothers' crimes. His work expanded beyond mere accounting into one of America's first systematic studies of religious exploitation. This was never about just one family's crimes, he wrote in 1850. The Westbrooks exposed vulnerabilities in how we balance religious freedom with public safety, questions we as a nation must address if similar tragedies are to be prevented. Emma Collins, Martha's cousin who had unwittingly facilitated her investigation, suffered profound guilt after learning the truth about the church she had joined. She became a key witness in the state investigations, providing crucial testimony about the brothers' operations despite threats from remaining church loyalists. After the investigations concluded, she established a shelter in Columbus for women who had escaped exploitative religious communities, one of the first such institutions in America. While the physical evidence of the Westbrook conspiracy has largely vanished, their churches demolished, their records destroyed, their settlements reclaimed by nature, certain artifacts periodically resurface. In 1890, a farmer near the site of the original Logan settlement discovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 40 individuals, including 27 children, all showing signs of death by disease. The grave configuration suggested hasty burial during an epidemic, consistent with Elizabeth Winter's diary descriptions. In 1923, renovations to an old Columbus building revealed a hidden cache of Westbrook Church documents, including partial settlement maps and property transfer records. These papers, now preserved in the Ohio State Archives, provided new insights into the brothers' methodology, including coded language used to disguise their true intentions in official correspondence. Most recently, in 1998, an antique desk purchased at an estate auction in Cincinnati was found to contain a false bottom concealing what appears to be Samuel Westbrook's personal journal from 1830 to 1832. The journal, currently undergoing authentication at the Smithsonian Institution, contains entries that suggest the brothers may have attempted to expand their operations into adjacent criminal enterprises, including insurance fraud and identity theft, concepts remarkably sophisticated for their era. Archaeological excavations conducted at several settlement sites in the 1970s revealed physical evidence supporting survivors' accounts. At the fifth settlement location near present-day Springfield, Ohio, researchers discovered the foundations of cabins built in flood-prone locations despite nearby higher ground being available, confirming deliberate placement in hazardous conditions. Analysis of soil samples from several sites confirmed historical accounts of conditions unsuitable for agriculture or long-term habitation. Perhaps most disturbing is the enduring influence of the Westbrooks' theological framework. Elements of their teachings, particularly their concept of chosen settlements and covenants of faith, have appeared in multiple religious movements throughout American history, suggesting their material circulated long after their deaths. As recently as the 1980s, authorities in Montana dismantled a religious community whose founding documents contain passages identical to the Westbrooks' covenant texts, though no direct lineage could be established. Religious scholars have identified what they term Westbrook patterns in various exploitative movements: charismatic leadership claiming divine authority, isolation of followers in remote locations, and financial arrangements that transfer assets to the organization. The Westbrooks didn't invent religious exploitation, notes theologian Dr. Robert Harmon, but they refined it into a terrifyingly efficient system that has unfortunately inspired others. Martha Collins, whose brave investigation triggered the Westbrooks' downfall, was officially declared dead in 1845 after exhaustive searches failed to find any trace of her. Her father established a foundation in her name dedicated to investigating religious fraud, which operated throughout the latter half of the 19th century. The Martha Collins Society funded investigations into suspicious religious movements and provided legal assistance to those seeking to leave controlling groups, work that continues through successor organizations today. In 1890, a woman in San Francisco claiming to be Martha briefly captured public attention, but investigations proved she was an imposter seeking financial gain from the Collins family. The true fate of Martha Collins remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the Westbrook case, with theories ranging from murder at the hands of Samuel Westbrook to a new identity established in another country. What Happened to Martha Collins represents the Westbrook's final secret, wrote Elizabeth Chambers in her 2005 analysis of the case. The brothers took that knowledge to their graves, leaving us with questions that may never be answered. Periodic claims of Martha Collins sightings continued well into the 20th century, becoming a kind of American folklore. In the 1920s, an elderly woman in a Paris boarding house reportedly told stories of the Westbrook brothers to fellow residents before disappearing when American visitors expressed interest in her account. In 1943, a donation to the Ohio Historical Society included a locket containing what appeared to be a later-life portrait of a woman resembling Martha, though its provenance could not be verified. The final known reference to the accounting, the master ledger documenting the brothers' operations, appears in a letter from a New Orleans antiquities dealer to a collector in Boston dated 1879. The letter describes a most curious volume containing records of religious settlements and their tragic fates, bound in red leather with unusual brass fittings. The dealer reported purchasing it from the estate of a deceased sailor who claimed to have acquired it from the effects of a religious man who met his end on the docks many years ago. The letter indicated the book had been sold to an unnamed European collector, and its location remains unknown. Some evidence suggests elements of the Westbrook organization survived the brothers' downfall. Court records from throughout the Midwest document legal proceedings against individuals identified as former church officials who attempted to establish similar operations on a smaller scale. As late as 1870, authorities in Nebraska dismantled a settlement that bore striking similarities to the Westbrook model, led by a man who had served as a deacon in their Columbus church. The Westbrook conspiracy shows us how easily religious devotion can be weaponized when combined with greed and charisma. Their story serves as a warning about the dangers of unquestioning faith and the vulnerability of those seeking spiritual meaning. In America's religious landscape, where freedom of belief is foundational but oversight is often limited, the line between sincere spiritual innovation and deadly exploitation remains dangerously thin. What do you think of this dark chapter in American history? Do you believe everything about the Westbrooks has been revealed, or are there still secrets buried in America's religious past? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this exploration of America's hidden horrors, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates historical mysteries. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face our nation's darkest truths. See you in the next video.